All right, we're live. It's 11 o'clock. Welcome everybody to Life Science Live this beautiful morning. I wish that I was actually outside in an aspen grove with the birds singing around, but I'm actually just in the elevator here at the Bee Museum. But it's nice and peaceful, and it relates to what we're talking about today, these trees behind me. So we are going to be discussing keystone species, and specifically some of the big keystone species here in Utah. I wish that I had time to talk about more of them. We're only going to talk about 3, but we're going to start off by talking about what a keystone species is. So you probably know what a keystone is. We talk about it in lots of different contexts, but I'm going to show you a little GIF just to get the idea across. Probably going to have angry comments about the proper way to pronounce that word, but anyway, so the keystone is, ooh, it's being real slow over there. There we go. So the keystone is that center rock in the middle of the arch, and it's leaving really fast, but you can see when you take a keystone, that middle part, out of an arch, the whole arch collapses. And that applies to lots of different things, and we use it in ecology when we talk about a keystone species. So the keystone species is a species that has sort of a disproportionately large effect on its environment. It's one species, it may not be super abundant, there might not be a whole bunch of them out there in the ecosystem that it's part of, but when you take it out, if you were to remove it, the rest of the ecosystem would collapse. So it's one organism, has a really big effect on its environment, and it can change the way the habitat is structured. It can change the other animals or plants that are able to live in that habitat. And like I said, there might not be that many of them out there in that specific ecosystem. And we're going to talk about some of them today. And the first one is one that is a keystone species throughout North America and also here in Utah that you've probably heard of and maybe even talked about as a keystone species. And it's this little guy right here. So this is a beaver. I'll scoot over a bit so we can get a better look at him. All right, so the beaver can be found in wetlands throughout North America, and the thing that makes him a keystone species is his dams. And I just realized I didn't get an actual picture of a dam, but I got a picture of what dams can do to a habitat. So here above on the top picture, we see an ecosystem before beavers were there, and then that same stream after beavers are there. So I'm sure you all know that beavers, picture of his teeth. So beavers have these really strong chompers. Those orange teeth are reinforced with iron minerals that makes them really hard on the front and able to chew through trees. So they'll go out, they'll chew down trees, they take those logs, they put together a dam, and they build that across a river. And when they do it, river or a stream, once it's there, it causes the water to slow down. Some of the water still gets through, it doesn't completely stop the water, but it slows it down, and everything past that will the water will open up. And you can see that in this picture. Before it was a really tight, narrow stream bed, and then after the dams came in, or the beavers came in and built their dams, you can see how the water slowed down and spread out. And that dam, it's providing a home for the beavers. The beavers are able to live in that slower moving water in that area. They're able to have all the plants that are now growing there, they're able to eat them, and then they're able to live in the dam that they've built in the water. But it also provides habitat for a lot of other species. The plants that we mentioned that are growing there now wouldn't be able to grow there if the water was still moving really fast. A lot of animals like amphibians and fish rely on these slower moving waters for spawning grounds where they lay eggs, where the young can be raised in water that's not quite so fast and harsh. It also changes the chemical structure of the water. As the water moves through the dam, the silt is filtered out, and so the water on the other side is cleaner and purer water, which is good for humans and for the animals that are living there. The beaver dams are able to slow floods, so by providing this this huge wetland area around where they built their dam. It provides a spot where the water can kind of come out rather than just flooding whatever's on the banks. Beavers are also ecological indicators, which is a fancy phrase to say that if the beaver's there, we learn something about that ecosystem. And when a beaver's in an ecosystem, it's a good sign that that ecosystem is healthy, that it's doing well. Beavers are pretty sensitive to their environment, and so if the stream isn't able to support them, they'll leave, they'll go somewhere else. And then we know that there's something wrong with that stream or that area. So if we were to take beavers out of a stream ecosystem, their dams, they're not keeping up those dams anymore, and so the stream could revert back to being a deep channel, fast moving, and not as good for habitat for a lot of those animals that rely on the wetlands created by beavers. Sometimes, especially now with so much development and human habitat destruction, we're pushing beavers out of the habitats that they would live in. And so we have had to kind of adjust for the fact that there aren't as many beavers as there used to be. And so one thing that people are doing to try and restore wetlands and those ecosystems is to create our own beaver dams. They're called beaver dam analogs, which they're basically just, we build them as close to an actual beaver dam as we can and try to recreate what a beaver would do to a stream. So this is actually a picture of a beaver dam analog. You can see they've built up this little, I can hold it the right way, they've built up this little fence across the middle of a stream channel. They've put vegetation and packed logs and mud into it. And they probably used other things too, like building it like a fence to sort of slow down all of that water. And so originally the stream looked like this, and you can see the side of the bank here. This is incised, it's cut really deep. The bank is really steep, the channel is really deep. If it was to rain, the water would just rush through here. It could flood everything around it. It's dirty and it's fast moving. It's not healthy. The plants here, there isn't that much growing close to the banks. There's a lot of just bare soil. Not much habitat for animals that need that wetland habitat and that slow-moving water and the plants. But after building the beaver dam analog here, it widened the stream channel. So you can see the water spread out, it slowed down, and there's a lot more vegetation growing on the banks where those different animals can make their habitats. And the cool thing about beaver dam analogs is that often they'll attract beavers. So once there's a beaver dam there, the ecosystem is healthier, and there's more resources available for the beaver, and the beavers will move in and they'll start building their own dams, and then you don't have to keep up your beaver dam analog because now the beavers are serving their purpose as a keystone species and maintaining that habitat. So the cool thing about beavers is that their dams and their status as a keystone species means that they're helping to support 43% of the endangered species in North America. So out of all of our endangered species here, beavers are helping almost half of them to have habitat, to have wetland where they can live. And so they're a very important species to all of the environments, well, all of the animals that rely on them, and to all of the ecosystems that they're a part of. So yeah, that's our beaver. I didn't really intend to talk about two different rodent species, but our next one is also a rodent species, which I realized a few minutes before I started. So we have a really large rodent over here with the beaver, and then our next keystone species is a bit smaller. This is a prairie dog. This one specifically is a white-tailed prairie dog. You can't tell because his tail is broken off, but I have a picture over here. There we go. Here's a live white-tailed prairie dog. You can see that cute little white tail, where he gets his name from. We actually have several different species of prairie dogs in Utah. One of them is very creatively called the Utah prairie dog. And you can see he doesn't have that same white tail. He's got a little bit different markings and patterns, but he's still a prairie dog. They still look very similar. And prairie dogs, a lot of people see them as a nuisance. They dig holes in in agricultural fields, which can be a big problem for machinery and things driving around. Depending on where they are, they could get into people's yards, or I've heard stories about them being near airports and causing problems with the structure of like the runway, messing up the concrete because they're digging underground. But they are super important to our habitats here in Utah and kind of throughout the western and central United States where prairie dogs are found. There are 170 species that depend on the Utah prairie dog for a lot of different things. And we'll go through some of those. Like, for example, the first one, prairie dogs, apparently, to a lot of animals, are really yummy. They provide prey to a lot of different species, to hawks and eagles and coyotes. I actually have pictures of just 6 of the different animals that eat prairie dogs. You can see there's a coyote, there's a badger, this is a kit fox, a golden eagle, a red-tailed hawk, and this is a black-footed ferret. And there's so many more that eat prairie dogs and rely on them as food. An interesting one is that black-footed ferret down there at the bottom. These guys eat almost exclusively prairie dogs. Their diet is almost 100% prairie dog, which is kind of a problem if there aren't very many prairie dogs out there. And that's one problem that we see with Keystone Species. If, for example, with prairie dogs, they're a nuisance to humans sometimes. And so people will start to try to push them out. A lot of people years ago were poisoning prairie dogs to try and get their numbers down so that they wouldn't dig so much in ranches and farms. Even just normal habitat destruction as we're building in their habitat can reduce the numbers of prairie dogs. And as that happened, it also started to reduce the number of black-footed ferrets. Black-footed ferrets were getting poisoned secondarily because they were eating poisoned prairie dogs. And black-footed ferret numbers went way down. We thought that black-footed ferrets were extinct several different times because they would disappear. We wouldn't see them for years, and we would assume there weren't any left. And fortunately, we've been able to sort of recover those black-footed ferret populations with lots of different management strategies. But some of those management strategies involved bringing back prairie dogs. And that's a really interesting way to see how a keystone species can completely affect another species. So as the black-footed ferret numbers go down, or as the prairie dog numbers go down, the black-footed ferret numbers go down. But it's not just black-footed ferrets. There are a lot of other animals that eat them, like we've talked about. And there are also animals that use their burrows. So prairie dogs, they dig through the ground, they build these intricate burrow systems, and then other animals will, once the prairie dogs have moved on to another place, other animals will come into those abandoned burrows and kind of take over and start living there. You guys have probably seen burrowing owls, and the funny thing about them is that even though they're called burrowing owls, they don't actually burrow. They don't do any digging themselves because their feet are small and they're birds. What they do instead is come in and live in the old black-footed prairie dog burrows. And without I'm mixing up names here. Prairie dog, just straight up prairie dog. Without prairie dogs, those burrowing owls wouldn't have a habitat to live in because they rely on those burrows. I'm gonna have to refocus myself there. These are not black-footed prairie dogs. They're just prairie dogs. This one's a white-tailed prairie dog. Anyway, so in addition to digging those burrows and other animals being able to use them as habitat, prairie dogs can also help shape the habitat above the ground. As they're digging through the soil, they push soil around, they create channels where air can get in, and it aerates the soil. And so it changes the structure of the vegetation that's growing above them. One really interesting interaction that we'll see in Utah is with prairie dogs and sage grouse. So as prairie dogs are digging around in that soil, they change the way that sagebrush grows. Sagebrush is really important, and you can see it out if you're driving down the road sort of farther out in the deserts and the shrublands of Utah. And it's really important to sage grouse. It's where the sage grouse gets its name because it lives in those sagebrush steppes and shrublands. And if sagebrush was just to grow everywhere, really thick and dense, it wouldn't be very good as sage grouse habitat. They need sort of a mosaic structure is one word that we'll use, where the habitat is sort of patchy. You have some more dense areas of sagebrush, you have some areas where there's not as much sagebrush, and the prairie dog digging around underneath the soil changes where the sagebrush grows, and it creates that patchiness and that mosaic structure. And that makes a much better habitat for animals like sage grouse and lots of other animals that live out there in the sagebrush habitat. So prairie dogs can be a nuisance, but they're super important, and that's why it's important to make sure that we don't just eradicate every animal that bothers us, which everybody knows, I'm sure. All right, so the last keystone species that we're going to talk about is not a rodent, and it's not an animal at all. It's a plant. And so all behind me, these trees that are on our picture in the elevator, this is an aspen stand. And that's what you call a big group of aspen trees. You can also call it an aspen grove. And aspens are cool because they grow in these groups like this, and all of these trees are most likely one tree in a way. They're all connected with their roots underground, and so a tree will put out its roots and then clone itself and make another stand of trees. So every tree in the stand is genetically identical because those roots will just shoot out and then make a new tree, and then that one will put out some more roots, and then a new shoot will come up from the ground. And with that underground root system, a lot of the mass of the tree is underground, which is really nice for the aspen when there's a fire. Aspen is a fire-tolerant and fire-dependent species. So as fire moves through the ecosystem, it burns down all the stuff that's above ground, and then the stuff that's under the ground is able to stay alive. And so once the fire's gone through, new trees start to grow up. And aspen is actually a shade-intolerant species, which means that if there's too much shade, aspen can't grow. And so as the stand of aspens gets older and more shoots come up, and there are lots of leaves overhead from those aspen trees, they actually can't make any more of themselves. The aspen trees that are old will start to die off, and then every time one dies off, it makes a little gap of light, and so a new tree is able to grow there. But if it gets too old and there are just a lot of trees with a lot of leaves blocking the ground, no new aspen trees will grow. So it's really important for fire to keep coming through and sort of burning out those old trees and creating space for new trees. And aspens are a keystone species because after that fire comes through, sometimes it can be hard for other species to establish again. But when the aspen has a fire come through, and now there's a lot of light, aspen comes up pretty quickly, and they can be there to provide habitat. Here's kind of a little series of pictures that show what that might look like. So you can see a fire comes through, a lot of the trees are dead, and then aspens will start to grow in and they fill. And then over time, those aspens actually, the shade created by the aspen can also make good habitat for shade-tolerant species, ones that do better in the shade, like conifer trees. So you'll start to see sort of a mixed, this says mixed wood dominance on the picture, but it's different kinds of trees all growing in the same space, and those conifers wouldn't be able to make it if it wasn't for those aspens providing the shade. And then as that gets older, the conifers might kind of push out the aspens so there aren't so many, but when fire comes through, those roots that have been underground are able to shoot up again. And it creates this cycle where the aspens grow, they provide lots of good habitat, and then as the ecosystem sort of shifts to a different stage with more conifers, the fire will come through and then make room for those aspens again. The cool thing about aspen stands is that the trees themselves, oh, I was looking for the picture of the leaf. Here's the leaf. an aspen leaf. This is a quaking aspen, like what we have here in Utah, our state tree. But those aspen trees are important habitat for a lot of different species. There are a lot of cavity nesting birds that really like to make their homes in aspen trees. Like, I was trying to find a good cavity on one of these trees. Here's the good part. So you can see like a little hole in the tree up there, or even higher up. There we go, up there. So it's pretty easy for like woodpeckers to drill holes into aspens, and then other birds to come and live in those holes that have been made. There's a lot of insects that rely on aspens. Beavers even. My beaver's over here. Beavers will chew down aspen trees because they have these nice thin straight trunks that make good logs for building dams. And all of those animals wouldn't be able to live in that place if it wasn't for the aspens, who have been helping to hold the soil together, helping to facilitate the growth of new trees and plants, and providing habitat for birds and other animals. The another cool thing, there's so many cool things about aspen, but they are the most biodiverse ecosystem in the Intermountain West. So out of all of the different types of ecosystems that we have here, aspen stands have the most different species living in them. And that's just one of the reasons that aspen are a keystone species. And that's the last species that I had for you today. If you guys had any questions or think of any questions later, you're welcome to put them in the comments. I'll try to remember to check back and see if anybody's asked anything. And I am excited to see you guys again next week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.